Let me start by introducing Dhiru Tadani. Born in Mumbai, an architect who has been living in Washington, D.C. and practicing as an architect for a number of years. Dhiru is indeed an old friend, not only of myself and a number of our faculty, but of the school as a whole, I would say. He was a visiting critic here a number of years ago. I thought it was practically just yesterday, but it's really longer than that, so I won't tell you when. And more recently, he was a Knight Fellow in our Knight Fellowship in Community Building, a program that was run in the school for mid-career executives in the last 6 or 7 years. But his first encounter with Florida, I would say, was back in the late 70s or early 80s, when through some encounters with Andres Swanee, he discovered as a Catholic University professor that there was an interesting project to assign to his students. And Dhiru assigned the town plan, the just made town plan of Seaside, to his studio. And the code, the first form-based code, which was derived by some of your faculty here many years ago for Seaside. And they said, we will test it. Here's something nobody's ever done before. We are going to test it. He's going to talk about it a little, so I won't spend too much time on it. But it produced a large-scale model of a build-out of Seaside. It gave everyone the confidence to go ahead and actually try to build it, and also produce a PA award. Maybe it was a citation for that project. So there's some very important beginnings there. He has been in practice over the years with Peter Hetzel and a firm called Ayers St. Gross, and has done a number of publications. He worked with our faculty on the Windsor Forum, a publication on architectural education, which was produced several years ago following a symposium. 5 Architects 20 years later, Town-Making Principles and Techniques. He has been on the board of the Congress for the New Urbanism since 2005. And so he's very closely tied to the efforts that many in this room make in terms of community building, architectural design, town making, and of course, researching and teaching the principles behind good urbanism. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dhiru, and maybe finally I should point out that this book probably would not have happened without Dhiru's great initiative and urging Leo to do it, and his, there's got to be a good word for stick-to-itiveness, his insistence and persistence in expanding the project as it went along to allow it to become what you will see tonight. So please help me welcome Dhiru Tadani.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, everyone. First of all, to the students at Miami, you all are extremely lucky. I've been around to many universities in the last 20 years, and this is a remarkable place to be at. So if you don't know how lucky you are to be here with this fantastic faculty, amazing building, just take my word for it. Compared to some of the other schools in the country, this is far excels as a great school to learn architecture and planning. Liz asked me to talk a little bit about the book and how it came about, and it really kind of starts off with something in Andres's revisionist history. He would always tell us for years and years that there was a time when architects and planners were highly respected. And if you think of the plan of Washington, D.C., and Macmillan and McKim and those guys, they were able to expand the mall by a mile and, really transform Washington in 1901. And that's just today, when you think of a public works project of that scale, it's just hard to believe that a group of 3 or 4 people could actually do that. And then, as Andres always reminds us, that we lost the respect as a profession, and partially, with the past 50 years of what we've been doing and what we've been presenting to the public, and now there's a tremendous dissatisfaction with what's been going on. So that brings me to the Prince, and in 1980, when we first met Andres, Peter Hetzel and myself, and we were teaching, he had finished a lecture on Alvar Aalto at Catholic University, which we liked a lot, and we said, look, why don't you come back in the fall and present this lecture again? And when we called him up in the fall, he said, I'm on to other things now. I don't want to really talk about Aalto, but I want to talk about town planning. And we kind of said, hey, that's great. Let's talk about town planning. And so he gave a lecture, and that was the initial seed of Seaside. It was still a kind of fragment. It wasn't really quite worked out. And then about a year later, we tested it. We built the model. And that's the model, one of the few surviving photographs. It's at a 16th-inch scale. And every single house, it was built by freshmen and sophomore, 115 students. And these are freshmen right out of high school following the code. And the sophomores did some of the larger buildings, and all the faculty and the teaching assistants did the public buildings. And it was around for a while, and it was a great kind of learning tool for all of us. And at that time, we got introduced to this book. It was around the same time, and some of the things that Andres, we all were talking about, we were wondering where the source material was and where we could actually learn more about it. And this was the first publication that we got stateside of Leo's work and some of the theories. And a lot of the ideas that were embodied in Seaside really were extremely well explained in this book. It kind of dealt with the entire scale of architecture to urban design to saving cities. And of course, there was this incredible diagram which we saw for the first time in 1983, and really explains what a city is, the public realm, the public spaces, and then the private realm, and the two of them together, that kind of civic and private world coming together to make a city. And Leo's house, the Krier house at Seaside, the upper left image shows the original house, and then the remodeled house painted a darker color and an addition added to it. So it was kind of, this history of actually taking something that you've designed and expanding it and changing the program. And so it's kind of malleable, and time had passed by. And then we kind of come to the book. We're trying to do the book, and in 1980, we were looking around for a publisher. It was very hard to find work by Leo, and it was almost impossible to find the last book that he did, which was Choice of Faith. And there were only copies available at Notre Dame. I remember in 1980, I showed up in Notre Dame, and there was a stack of the books there. It was the only place you could buy the book. No other bookstore, nobody else had the book. And what was surprising to me was that Leo had started to actually build buildings, and there was no real place, a forum to actually see those buildings. And of course, there were all the modernists who said, we really don't need this book because it wasn't really off the time and the spirit of the age and all that stuff, so I won't go into that. But at the same time, there was these 4 issues that were emerging, and some of us were dealing with, or not quite as articulately as we thought, but these were the 4 issues that seemed to be at the forefront of architecture and urbanism, all actually problems that could be solved by true urbanism. There was, the post-peak oil era, climate change, public health, and demand and supply of housing. The marketplace was still producing houses that really didn't fit they were still producing large houses when only 27% of families exist in the U.S., and there were still these large homes. So there was a real misfit between what was being produced in the marketplace and supplied, large homes, large lots, and what people really wanted. And all those four things were kind of coming together as solutions were available in good urbanism. And of course, there was the Prince of Wales, who had done his famous speech and was sort of thrashed so unjustly. And I have him there asking Leo for a plan, and that was what Leo produced, Poundbury. And if anyone has not been to Poundbury, you should definitely plan on visiting it, because it's truly an amazing place to visit. So I had the opportunity to go there in the early 80s and realized that there wasn't, again, any good information available on some of these places, and kept talking about how can we actually bring this material, show that the theoretical base could actually be built, and there were enough examples of built work. And then I was in Portugal and came across this little museum research center that Leo had done with two Portuguese architects. And for the first time, I started to understand that the program of this building, which most architects would have approached by building a single building, what Leo did was he kind of broke it down into a series of 7 or 8 buildings with courtyards. And walking around this place, it was really a remarkable experience that there was a building that represented the library, the curved form was the auditorium, and each typologically you could understand each building and what its function was, what was actually occurring in those buildings. And it kind of made a little village of a very complex program. And the pieces that, it was a complex program, and I spent the entire day there walking around talking to folks and realizing that there was this wonderful way of taking a complex program and breaking it down to the essential archetypal forms. And that was the kind of key project for me, to start saying that, okay, this theory and the idea of archetypal forms, breaking the program down, can actually be applied in real building. I show you this because along the way, when we were doing the book, which took 8 years to do, we actually corrected a few things. So this is not really the site plan. There are a few corrections. It's actually the site plan that Leo wanted, as opposed to the site plan that was built. So and we had a lot of fun actually correcting mistakes, changing things, and tweaking little pieces. So if you students ever visit these buildings and you have the book, you'll see that there are some discrepancies, which were all done in fun, including those rooftops of your buildings that surround this building. They're not as clean. There's a lot of mechanical equipment that was very distracting in these images that we cleaned up, so that the focus was, so they're not actually available. So environmentalists don't think you've got all those green roofs to go out and build gardens on top of, because it's a lot messier than that. And then there was some details on this building that we also cleaned up, and there's a long history of that. And along the way, along this period, Leo started building a new house in Uzès in France, and I thought we decided not to include it in the book, but I'm going to show you a couple of images. I was just there a month ago, and it's absolutely an amazing house, showing that you can really do a lot with traditional materials. And the drawing on the left, the image on the actual built house on the right, the living room, and some of these incredible details, which are really inventive. You get this incredible scale with very simple, very elegant, very simple forms. And the study. So again, if you look at any of Leo's buildings, you realize that the ceilings are always incredibly treated, and here this timber frame ceiling with real trusses. And his desk and his piano. Some of you might know that besides architecture, he loves to play the piano, and here he is at the piano, and the house is full of books everywhere. Yes. And this incredible view of the castle from the balcony, from that little terrace on top. So it's one of these little high forms that define the skyline, if it says. So once the book came out, there was a lot of calls, a lot of flurry about the book, and I was tempted at that time to do this take on the Liechtenstein drawing. Anyway, it was a lot of fun kind of working and speculating on some of these things. And here's Leo kind of pontificating, and some of you might know where this is, and some of you might wonder where it is, but it's not identified in the book for a particular reason, so some of you might be guessing on where exactly this is, and it's really a wonderful abstract composition. But in the end, I think what this book does for all of us is really empowers us. And to really have a theory, and recently someone said to me that what they saw in the book was absolutely a complete theory of urbanism, and that was the kind of biggest contribution that this book made, was that it was, in fact, the only book that is a complete, whether you agree with it or not, it was a complete theory of urbanism. Leo's dealt with every single aspect of the built form and the urban form. So, and this is the dust jacket of the book. The first image I showed is actually the hardcover version, and the dust jacket. So with that, I'd like to introduce Leon Krier, who did not have a formal education in architecture, is self-taught, and only spent one semester in the university, worked for James Sterling for several years, and taught ever since, has been teaching continuously in a university somewhere in the world for the last 35, 40 years. And probably, as I just said, the one person who does have a complete theory on urbanism and how to repair cities. Please welcome Leon Krier.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's of course an enormous pleasure to be here and look at this religious audience. It feels like having a high mass or having some music, rather than talking about architecture. Diru says that I was self-taught. I was self-taught by my brother and a few people I met along the way. And it was a moment in the late 60s when I started architectural studies. It was so bad that within a few months I knew that I couldn't go on because it was absolutely toxic what was being taught, and my brother, having been subjected for 5 years to that sort of treatment, he convinced the family that it would be okay if I left the university. And I never regretted it because the teaching in the late 60s at Stuttgart was basically geared towards industrialization of building. And any deviance from that straight path would be considered absolutely anachronic, and you would be made to feel very bad if you stayed for a while. I then worked for Jim Sterling for a while and wanted always to make a diploma at the AA, Architectural Association in London, but was asked to teach before I was able to apply for studying. And it was an interesting school then, because this was 1973-74, I was teaching beside Elia Zengelis and Bernard Schumi and Peter Cook, and it was an interesting experiment in architectural tolerance, because there were all these people who taught absolutely contradictory positions, and they were all friends, which I thought was a bit excessive at the moment, because I was rather intolerant, and but was this whole atmosphere of late empire and sort of wearing things a bit looser, which I think I learned to be myself more tolerant and be interested in other positions than myself, because I started from a strictly Corbusian doxa, and then having grown up in a beautiful small town which was wrecked by that same rather immature theory, I started to rethink and get involved in theory almost despite myself, because writing articles to defend patrimony of a beautiful city, one looked naturally for authorities who would be alive and would be able to deliver a system of ideas which would contrast with the imposition of an ideology which was clearly destructive, and the first signs were absolutely devastating on the delicate urban fabric, as Luxembourg was when I grew up there. And not finding any available theory, I started to develop my own, because whatever I read, starting with Alderossi and all the so-called reformist theories or revisionist theories in the late 60s and early 70s, there was nothing you could really trust a beautiful town, into the hands of those theories, because they were absolutely unprepared to deal with the complexity of what erroneously was called historic fabric. What historic fabric actually designates is mature fabric rather than immature structures. And it took me a long while to develop this, find this out, also in contrast with many of my peers. And clearly, Miami, when I came here first, there was already a very strong seed developing here. And when I met first Liz and Andres, I felt there were people there who one was tuned to. And it was them who later got me involved in building, because I was so desperate at the time that I said, I was famous then for saying that I was only able to do architecture because I didn't build. Now, I got involved in building for about 20 years, and I'm now convinced that I was right, that this intuition, because it is almost impossible to play today, honestly, the role of architect in what we historically are meant to do, is to be concerned with form and how detail fits into a larger picture. But training and ideology have reduced us to rather a low-level authority of technical devices, and losing completely the overview over what all this is going to add up to. And I think, obviously, the people who have been teaching here and developing ideas are one of the very small groups, or very few spots around the planet, of people who are conscious of what they are doing. This is why, for me, it was such satisfaction to do this building, along with Liz Plater-Zyberg and also the faculty. Now that the product is not exactly what we all dreamed of, is, of course, when ideas encounter the real world. And the real world is probably never the way you want it. But I think you can only do great architecture when what you do is just tuning what is happening anyway. Because that is why you need architects to do things a little better than what is done anyway by the industry in a normal, standard way. And that is why you need special talent. And there are few people who are talented for this, and that is what architects are about. It's really to do something which other people are not able to. We are not able to do other things, but everyone is supposed to play his role and get his pleasure in life his own way, the way he's gifted. And this is where I think the great problem lies today, is that through education and above all through orientation towards the real world of production and the reduction, industrialization of the real world to mechanical repetitions and dismembered professions, is where the real problem lies. And that is why all our collective actions so rarely do something which is really in tune with our lives. Now, I have been this book, which Jorge has put together over 4 years, single-handedly, because we couldn't find a new editor for the book, and Papadakis was basically out of business and was no longer interested in that sort of line of thinking. And so it's only by Jorge's patience and also the encouragement from Liz and Andres that this book was done in a digital form on his own desktop, and that then we were able to find a publisher. Because I had burned my chances by doing a book about Albert Speer and then getting involved with the Prince of Wales, and none of these people were highly regarded by the media, and I had been taken the oxygen of publicity, as Sir Norman Foster said one should do to the Prince of Wales, but I felt this lack of oxygen urgently for a while, and blissfully this book seems to have a good chance on the market, and it has to do with the packaging, the formatting, also the title, and the right moment probably, because a crisis, environmental crisis, all these things, these questions which are being asked are very positive for us, because we have been working at answers now for 40 years, and some of them turn out to be actually working. The chapter of the book I'm talking about tonight is called The Architectural Tuning of Settlement, and it is really to be seen as a complement to Andres Duani's lexicon of urbanism, which categorizes development patterns and types into several categories. Now, these are categories which are basically functional, typological, and of course they extend into studying character and color and density, but I thought that there is an instrument needed which is relating architecture more closely to town planning. And not mixing them up, because many architects, as you know, when they go about designing architectural pieces, whether they are a chair or an entire region, consider it as an architectural project, whereas town planning and urbanism are not really to do with architecture, but they are strictly related, and there's a very strong relationship between one and the other, and in order to form a very powerful bond and a powerful composition, it needs an instrument which is, I think now that the intuition is lost, needs to be conscious. And I have been struggling with this idea for a while because I was involved on the sides discussing Seaside for a while, and I always thought that not knowing completely why, but that there was a problem in the conception of Seaside of the plan, particularly about the center, and the architectural response which came about on the terrain and in the over 20 years of building there. And I thought there is something which is not quite correct about it, trying to understand what it was. And that is why I wrote this little brochure, which became a chapter in the new book. Now, that book, which Jorge put together, is really a collection of essays and articles and ideas and drawings, which have been collected over a period of 30, 40 years, and then hammered into a single document in order to make continuous argument, also which raises a lot of questions, but also suggests answers, but is not supposed to be and not meant to be a complete theory, but more an indication of theory, because there has been and there had been a technology of town planning and architecture which existed for many, many centuries, but we have lost, and which has been lost through the development of modern building techniques and planning techniques, largely related, as we now find out, to the use and abuse of fossil fuels. That is, I think, really the single element which explains why things went so badly out of tune and out of order. Now, how to have an instrument which can render large pieces of human work and imagination and contradictory interests harmonious is almost something which is unthinkable. When you look above, when you stand on the Gianicolo above Rome or on the Eiffel Tower, and you overlook these enormous compositions which Paris or Rome or other great cities were, and that they could present anything approaching a harmonious image is almost to us unimaginable when we look at more recent cities, which can look, and Miami, of course, when you are swimming the sea and you are far away from buildings, can look extremely interesting and attractive. But when you get right in the middle of the element, there is a big problem of coordination and also of creating a space which is socially viable, particularly when it's going on in the dynamic which it has taken on over the last 30 years. Now, this is about basically the ordering devices, which I will explain are to do with classicism and vernacular. You are familiar with all these terms because many people here practice it. And despite the official ideology and almost against it. And many young people think, but what's classism? Or older people think, what is classism about? What is relevant? It's not trend, It's not really what we are interested in today. And I would say that good sex is about classicism. Real satisfying sex and sexual relations are about classicism. It's not about more nor about less. It's just about the right amount at the right time with the right people. And so it's not something too much or too little. It's just the right thing at the right time and in the right dosage. Now, because sex is often today sold as it's the more you have, the more sexy it is. No, the bigger the breast is not necessarily more sexy. It's really about proportion, the right quantity at the right time and at the right distance. So my students at Yale who are not trained in classicism, I use an exercise which is very convincing. They have to measure up and to do measured drawing of some object, whether it's a vase or column or a malleable object, and then they have to deform it, either horizontally or vertically. And it's through deformation that you actually find where is the correct measure. And I'm always reminded by it when listening to somebody who tunes an instrument. You first overstretch the string and then let it go back to the correct vibration. So we take an object and then deform it either horizontally or vertically. And if you do that now by photoshopping, you can all try that out. And you know all these digital images which are being now produced, that there's this enormous, this incredible instrument of mastering form, and which needs, of course, an increased judgment in order to master it. Sorry, I still haven't learned to master this hydra. If you read Künstler's book, and I think it's a colossally important book on the long emergency, you find out that it's the use of fossil fuel which not only changed our perception of land, time, and energy, but above all, it has created a form of feeling of power over the environment, which can be equal to a form of hubris. And we are now, as you know from old mythology, hubris is always followed by terrible nemesis And I think we are starting now a process of paying for excess, because obviously the extension of the power realm, which is related and caused by the use of fossil fuels, extends our material powers enormously, but does not extend our intellectual faculties at all. On the contrary, we are overwhelmed by these colossal energies which we are supposed to master, but neither our individual nor our collective brains nor our computers are really able to master this sort of wealth of power which we have inherited in the last 200 years. And I think that Künstler's main idea is that the oil peak, whenever it happens, and there are people who deny that it will ever happen within our lifetime, but that's not the important issue when it happens, or whether it happened yesterday or in 20 years. But the importance is that the oil peak and the range, the form of the peak is not going to be a symmetrical figure. But once you reach that peak, there will be a collapse. Whether we are in the first stages of that collapse is another question, but that it will collapse is an absolute certainty. Because with reaching that peak, we will have to completely change our ideas of economic, intellectual, and artistic growth, which we have been growing up with. And this is a little hypothesis about architecture, that with the oil peak being reached, we also reach an absolute minimum of traditional production and a maximum of modernist production. And with the oil peak, the following collapse after the oil peak, because we won't have the capacity through permanent, or the idea of permanent growth, to pay for the accumulated depth. And that is something, the big mystery. Who is going to pay for this colossal debt which has been accumulated? And of course, it will be the people after us and who will suffer from it. Now, not only is there no understanding, but very little mastery of what should happen. And now there's, of course, the idea that the new moralists come up and say we have to save the planet so that we can have more people after us, and that we have to save fossil fuels for the future. You wonder why one should save fossil fuels for the future. Nobody has explained either. Whether the Earth is really heating under the influence of fossil fuels or sunspots, it's not entirely clear. But what we know is that this hypergrowth and the excessive capacity of material production is something which we cannot master. And that it will lead, or it has already led, it leads to forms of extreme violence and of extreme damage done to others than ourselves, because we don't quite control the system. So the basic building types which have grown out of the use of fossil fuels are buildings which are generally of single functions and excessive in scale, and generally in excessive accumulations. Now, the accumulation of these buildings do not form cities. We still call them cities, but they are essentially storing areas for buildings, and generally in single functions. Now, if you have the same function happening over a vast geographical area, you virtually pre-program architectural uniformity. And it's the refusal of uniformity which leads to architectural superficiality and fake variety, basically to architectural kitsch. Because the problems of horizontal spread and vertical spread, of hyper extension and hyper vertical concentration, I would call them both sprawl. Generally, you call sprawl something horizontal, but I think that the skyscraper city is also a sprawl city, is just driving vertically. In horizontal, you have horizontal cul-de-sacs, and in vertical, you have vertical cul-de-sacs, and probably the most asocial way of building is vertical cul-de-sacs, the skyscraper, which so few people have the means to think about. But it's really, when you think what these buildings are more, how to order these buildings into communities, again, then you find there's an absolute impossibility to build communities out of suburbia and out of vertical sprawl. So it's really the monofunctional zoning and these colossal extensions of the human habits, daily habits, which create mega structures which are virtually architecturally untunable, unreformable, that can only be fake variety and fake community and social isolation or segregation. Now, basically, all the reactions against early historic, what is now called historic modernism, are to do with the reactions by the same means against something which had been badly understood. So you have the postmodern variety of funny skyscrapers and the organic variety and the high-tech variety, but it's all virtually the same stuttering, architectural stuttering. There is no architectural speech. There is nothing comparable to what is generally understood as traditional architectural language or settlement. Because uniquely, these traditional architectural languages are not historic, we call them, because they were originated before fossil fuel age. But on the other hand, it's those which have created individual languages related to region and location. Now, there's an interesting comparison with language, because baby talk, babies talking around the world for the first 6 months speak exactly the same language. Baby talk is universal. It's a kind of music which is pre-language, but it's pure sound which reaches and finally rejoins content and meaning. And it is through climate, nourishment, altitude, and of course different material conditions that language become those which we call traditional languages. Now, anyone speaking 6,000, imagine a person speaking 6,800 languages as they are now around the world, he would be considered an absolute incredible person. There is nobody speaking all the languages in the world, nor anyone capable of learning all those languages. Would be highly considered. But imagine an architect who would be able to design all the architectures around the world. He would be considered like a complete lunatic, an anachronic creature, which is no longer meaningful in our day and age. Because now it's the age of one architecture for one planet. And architects delivering exactly the same type of building, whether they build in Beijing, in Buenos Aires, or in the Sahara Desert. And of course, unrelated to climate, to altitude, and to culture. And it is really an architecture purely related to the fossil fuel age, because it's only with this extraordinary machinery, auxiliary machinery, that you can manage an architecture which is insensitive to climate, to culture, to altitude, and to material conditions on the ground. So I think to think correctly about architecture is to think architecture without fossil fuel, whether we have it or not. I think that is the discipline which is needed in order to go back to a proper architectural speech. And if we don't have it by obligation, we should have it at least at our intellectual choice to discipline our languages. So when we go to, when we are asked to build in China, we don't build as if we were building in England or in Florida. I was recently asked by a group of Chinese developers to build my English project in Singapore or Shanghai, I forget where it was. And I said, yes, but when I come to China, I will of course design a Chinese city. And they said, no, we want English town in China. I said, but I'm not the right person, so you have to go to another address. And they couldn't understand why I would refuse. And the situation is now so confused that we really need, because I was in the theory class with Diro at 2 o'clock here, and we really need the theory to correct the intuitions which we are now confronted with, which are produce almost by intuition the wrong answers to our environmental problems. Now, we have been with this problem of uniformity and excessive beyond human scale for at least 200 years, because fossil fuels have been around, and accumulation of power, imperial power and fossil fuels make an extraordinary, they do not come around on one day, but they need, of course, a long period of time. And when you see the buildings built around by Nash, great architect, but built around Regent's Park, they are already a uniform zoned architecture displaying this extraordinary variety of facades, pretending to be royal palaces. In fact, they are bourgeois apartments hiding behind an order of architecture which is totally unrelated to what is behind. It already happened in Bath 50 years before, and so this deregulation of the language and excessive material power, which is no longer controlled by an intellectual discipline, has been with us, and we are at the very end of this process of loss of control. And that is why there are now so many people thinking about it, because we are really at the point of necessary return before absolute suicide. And I'm not talking about, I don't know enough about climate change to to know whether we cause it, but we are definitely before an intellectual suicide, which, and you see it with all the contortions and completely idiotic buildings which are being built with great publicity around the world, and that there's like a kind of collusion of doing the maximum damage now to cities with a minimum intellectual effort. And in order to get back to this right, to the at least nearly correct way of building cities, needs really a very large effort, and I think it has been undertaken by many people present here and ourselves, but we are still a small church. We are not a vast group of people. And we need a lot of support because we don't have it. I don't have a single building in Italy now which has not been sabotaged by a modernist clique. I was recently in a town which was built according to my guidelines, but which is an absolute monster. And obviously people don't know why these things go wrong. They are promised one thing and then they get delivered another. And in order to understand what happens, one needs really to go to the bottom of it. Now, you all know the strange feeling you have when you are down in Fifth Avenue looking at St. Patrick's. And it's so strange to have this monumental church, which is brilliantly designed, but in the shade of these enormous palaces, glass palaces. And one could call that private imperialism. I think when the private realm is so excessively powerful that anything collective is completely smashed and degraded in its shade. And then the other excess, which is public imperialism, which is of course the excessive forms in the form of communism and socialism and whatever you would call this phenomena, where everything is supposed to be invested into the public interest and public realm. But it is actually this formula of having a highly defined public realm, but which is limited and within town or within the landscape to become symbolized by special buildings, but sitting in a fabric of private enterprise. And it's this kind of mix which forms, I think, which is the formula which has been so successful. And it's really the choice between city and suburbia, between urban settling and suburban structures. So far, politics have purely decided to go to suburbia, and I doubt it that the White House is informed about these matters. I always expected that Liz and and Andres would be occupying an office in the West Wing, but unfortunately the president doesn't know, and he should know, because these are issues. These are really presidential issues because the base is rotten, and it is from the top down that this new information and that this new culture has to come. I had great hopes in the organic good sense of democratic electorate, but in the last 15, 20 years I have learned otherwise. My brother has just finished a very large ensemble in my hometown, where I was involved in for many years, and I just left in disgust. And now that the ensemble it's a Justice Palace for Luxembourg, which is like a small city on a rock, and it's absolutely splendid. And it looks like it had been there for a while, but now the people in the street, the common people who are supposed to like these things, or they used to like them, without prejudice, they ask my sisters, why do they do these buildings? Why can't they be modern? People in the street, the people who are not supposed to know anything about architecture, because they have been so submitted in the last 15 years with bombardments from the media that these buildings which are anachronic and they shouldn't like them, and why don't they build them in glass and steel like everybody else? That now the common reaction is, why can't these people be modern like everybody else? No. And so we have done an ensemble which is rather dignified, and people who use it are absolutely delighted. But the common perception is that this is something which shouldn't have been done, because it is, people now stream to I.M. Pei's Museum of Modern Art, which doesn't even have a collection. But we get criticized for something which is fitting very well into the old town, and so on. So things, democracy is not necessarily going our way. And I think that it's really a matter of elite, of thinking, and bringing down the ideas from top down, because from the bottom up, they don't necessarily grow anymore, because the ground has been intoxicated by silly ideas. Now, architectural tuning. Many ideas are now commonly perceived as good. That okay, everybody agrees with the pedestrian city, but I say pedestrian city, horizontally, yes, of course, not more than 10 minutes walk for each urban district, people agree. But when you say pedestrian city also vertically, they wonder, but are you not a little reactionary? Why are you against lifts, or what do you call them? Yeah. No, I'm not against it, because for invalids and handicapped people, they are fantastic, lifts. But for normal, still gift people with feet and legs, vertical walking staircase is very, very healthy. But you don't want to walk more than 3 or 4 floors every day in a regular fashion. That is why the wealthy people used to live on the ground and first floor, and the poor lived under in the loft. Now it's the other way around. So the motorized sprawl. I love cars and I love to drive, and I drive more and more because I know it's now a limited enjoyment, because it's absolutely fantastic to have a car, but it won't be around for much longer. So we have to enjoy every drive we make, because it's a precious thing which will not last. And we are privileged to have these machines, but we have to conceive already now, if we want the society not to collapse in absolute violent chaos, to prepare cities for a much reduced fossil fuel use. And that is where architectural order of a traditional scale comes in again. So I think I think many people agree that cities should be organized in independent quarters, as they always were, largely related to pedestrian motion. But how large these conglomerates of small cities should be, or whether they should be distributed around the geography and wherever they should be useful, more related to agriculture, I think that is the next step to master. And that is really where science is lacking and where it is bitterly needed, because political decisions, as you know, democratic decisions are supposed to be based on statistical data which have scientific value. And there is absolutely no work giving instruction to the political realm in which they could take intelligent decisions. So how to decide if we are lacking information about it? And yet there is enormous pressure of now an ecologically critical public who don't want to behave ecologically because it would mean sacrifice. But they want politicians to take the right decisions, and we are absolutely lacking the instrument to inform us how the end product of all these decisions are supposed to look. So we are just in the beginning of grasping this material and even formulating problems, and the big danger is now that there is this need for an ecological conscience and consciousness and science, that the merchants who sell the wrong merchandise with the right title are now winning the entrance to the West Wing. And they are crowding even the entrances, and they are selling all sorts of objects which have absolutely no future to wait for. So, there's a whole culture which is needed, and we are just starting to grasping these the complexities. So I think the main issue is relating architecture and urbanism to what is the mature form of the city, and how should cities be related to landscape. How many cities and how many citizens can you have per landscape? So that the science should address issues and have responses for a political responsible realm, that under what political conditions, and those are the questions which need to be addressed and answered, under what political conditions, dictatorship, democracy, monarchy, authoritarian or tolerant, in what different forms, how many people can be housed, in what geographic environment, and in what economic modes of production. Because it's only when you study those various elements scientifically that you can have answers, because we think we are all nice people. We love each other, and we can walk in the streets without being robbed every day. And we think all those barbarians out there in Afghanistan, it's just robbers and so on. But the fact that they are robbing out there is strongly related to our political system being relatively safe here. And we have exported the violence we need to get our fossil fuel. We have exported it not only out of our geography, but out of our heads. So that young people are growing up with the idea that all this manna comes to us as natural way, because we earned it. Forgetting that we get this stuff through military might, delegated military might, and extreme violence, with extreme sacrifice for other people than ourselves. And it's only by growing a consciousness in how far we are empire, and in that sense, there is literature, but in how far the political forms, our settlement forms, the materials we use, and the energies we use in order to travel around every day, including myself. I'm not flying across the ocean is not exactly a highly commendable activity for everyone. So that we become conscious of what we are doing in a large sense. Now, I'm coming now to the subject. This was just a prelude to what I'm now talking about. Is really how to get all this stuff in order, to get an order which is not only replicating nature, but which is incontested and which can create an environment which is less toxic, more socially amenable, and less violent towards the outside. I do not imagine I have a response, but at least a form of questioning which could be interesting for architecture. Now, the terms of vernacular and classicism are perfectly well known for languages. You know what is vernacular language and you know what is classicism. And it's also known for architecture. There's a strong distinction in the English language of what is classicism and what is vernacular. There's absolutely no, there are books about it, there are dictionaries who explain very clearly what that means. These terms are rarely used in urbanism, and I think that is where there's an interesting clue. And I corrected the drawing which Diru showed, that bringing this economic plan in the middle, the economic stuff, the private stuff, into a vernacular form. So that there is a relationship of vernacular and the everyday, the domestic, and the economic side of things, and classicism something to do with institutional level education, culture, public representation, maintenance of value, and cultivation of value, and celebration of value, which are collective. Now, once you have created an organism which you can call a true city, it becomes such a powerful mix of private and public stuff, which is not only to do with real estate investment, but also with form, which becomes so attractive that they become an extremely powerful development for a magnet for development, which means that if you develop a mature urban body, you destroy it because it's undevelopable. It has reached its mature forms and it should undergo a stage of maintenance. How to do that in a culture which is obsessed with development and redevelopment. So instead of developing immature parts of our cities, we are now obsessing architects with developing areas which are perfectly mature and should be just maintained. And there is now a kind of almost sexual obsessiveness of architects trying to put in signs of our time into buildings which have been around for 1,000 years, just by slashing in a glass corridor or breaking historic fabrics apart and showing signs of our time, materials, synthetic materials in buildings which were purely conceived and maintained with natural materials. Now, once you let that overdevelopment happen, there is no defense because your whole intellectual instrument and legislative instrument to defend the structure and the proportion and the density collapses. Once you have one skyscraper, utilitarian skyscraper, in traditional fabric, it's finished. There's no way you can argue and stop the next ones. And the fate of skyscraper city is that there is absolutely no control at all. There's no intellectual control, it's just suicide is the end effect of skyscraper city, because it's a city which is going to destroy itself by suffocation, by extreme concentration of unmanageable amounts of value and real estate. And it's exactly the parallel to the fraudulent investment, speculative investments, which are now collapsing around the world. Because nobody can say, if you go on building, let's say there is no problem with oil peak, there's oil forever. And we will dominate the world with our military empire forever. There will not be problems. We'll just go on building our cities with the skyscrapers that they are now blooming around. Which means that central cities every single building lot will be a skyscraper. And you know it's already with a few skyscrapers there about, which seem like many when you look at silhouette, but when you look at the plan of Manhattan, there are actually very few skyscrapers. I think there are between 200 and 300. Now imagine Manhattan with every single lot being a skyscraper. You already feel it around 5th and 42nd Street or 53rd Street. There are too many, it's twilight all day round, even with sun shining and so on. It's a city absolutely without future and with lunatic people and total devaluation of all relations other than the maximum spending power. And because the skyscraper is a vertical cul-de-sac exactly the replication of the horizontal cul-de-sac you have in suburbs, because they are over-concentration of single functions on a single node, which is going to overuse the urban grid and kill it in the end by excessive use. Now, architecturally, because they are purely the only real reason for building skyscrapers is money. There's nothing romantic about it. It's the maximum exploitation of the smallest possible piece of land with the simplest form of structure and the maximum social isolation on a single spot. And even when you see Frank Lloyd Wright talking about the skyscraper, you really, after 10 minutes, you cannot think that an intelligent person can be so absolutely dumb because he wanted to build the mile-high skyscraper and it's completely idiotic. And you see, he loses, after 5 minutes, you lose all respect for the man because he had absolutely no intellectual control of what he was doing. So there's something absolutely toxic and destructive about these ideas. So skyscrapers are something which you should be, I think, morally should be castigated as something morally untenable. It's an over-exploitation of real estate purely for money interest. I'm not against money at all, but it's an excessive amount of money making on very destructive structures. Now, they can look interesting from afar, but if you see the consequences of building such things with the fruit of empire for several generations, that how absolutely destructive this is. And I remember this interview with Afghan drug dealers. They were sitting around in their beautiful historic clothes in a mud hut. They were sitting talking very mysteriously about their deals and so on. And then the camera turned high and it made like a circular movement. And above their heads was a frieze, continuous frieze of skyscrapers, mostly American. Which is very interesting. You know, they were dressed in medieval dress, dealing with world empire of drugs and dreaming of skyscrapers. Just wanting to, I mean, I always overdo things a bit, but really want to make you feel really bad about skyscrapers because they are really terrible. I love to be up there and have a flat overlooking things, but the consequences are absolutely terrifying. Now, classism, as I said, is very well known in architectural terms and where it comes from and how far the classical language is a symbolic language of construction, imitating primitive structures made of wood and creating an artistic symbolic language in order to design buildings which are of import not just to the family or to the individual but to the collectivity. And in order to give an almost what Hannah Arendt called near immortality to structures which are highly fragile and give an impression of immortality to mortals, which is necessary in order to rebuild every day the necessity of having structures which transcend our lifespan and give some stability to lives which are so unstable and totally menaced by change which we do not master. So we know all that, but when you really understand the importance of this by reverting the system. Imagine that monumental buildings, they have just stripped down language and then the midget classism, which we are now used to because we can't get public classism. People build little chateaus and what Diru showed, the garage with French castellation and all sorts of architectural verbiage, which has become totally meaningless by not having the right scale, because classism is an architectural language which is necessary to apply to large structures because otherwise they look extremely brutal and primitive. And in order to make the public realm appear like civilized and elegant and acceptable, and not just an excess of scale and a blowing of muscle building power. So this relationship of the monumental and the domestic, we know it very well from, and how it has been correctly applied, and also how it is misapplied nowadays. And in this chapter on tuning, I have done a few drawings which explain this problem of scale, that today often you see these enormous hotels which are blown out of scale but with a minimum language, vernacular language, and they look like oversized cottages. Whereas the palaces, the little palaces you see down suburbia with many orders look completely out of scale. And it is this, the relation, the necessity of having a monumental language, an architectural language of building, but still in an architectural and tectonic logic, which speaks of architecture rather than of family problems or non-architectural themes, which is needed in order to create this contrast of public and private. What is less known, and what I try to introduce here, is that use these terms, vernacular and classical, also in urban, for urban patterns and geometry. Now we know that classicism in nature is a very rare occurrence, and extreme beauty, uncorrectable perfection is almost nowhere the case, and there's always something you can Photoshop and correct, because nature is essentially vernacular. And but there are classical patterns in the micro scale and the extreme macro scale. You have forms of Euclidean perfection, like the, I don't know, the crystals or the floral forms of snow crystals and so on. Yet Euclid is really a master of abstraction. You don't find Euclidean geometry in the real world. There is no straight line. There is no absolute point. These are abstractions. And yet Euclid is the man, even though there are very few streets dedicated to Euclid in Europe. In America you find in every town one. But is that the absolute regularity of urban pattern, when you look at it from the air, how it enters into unbelievable, unresolvable contrast with nature. And you have this Jeffersonian grid spreading over hundreds and hundreds of miles in this total disregard of the natural streams and patterns and topography of nature. Now, generally we call organic patterns, settlement patterns, villages in England or in Maine, or let's say non-Euclidean patterns, we call them medieval, which is an absolute error, because the Middle Ages were also a time of high Euclidean culture, and it's not because things are crooked that they are medieval. What we mean is that they are maybe underdeveloped and middle intelligent, or just under the middle level of intelligence. But the straight line and the meander are not contrasting, or they are not contradictory forms. Rivers don't flow straight because there is a reason why they meander. And sometimes the meander is a rational form, much more rational than the straight line. And also historically, when you know about town foundations, it's not true that all town foundations throughout history were always done on a regular Euclidean pattern or Hypodamian pattern. There are many, many town foundations in the Middle Ages, German towns in the East, which were founded on irregular patterns, much more sensitive or much more sensitive to the topography, because it's much easier to have a vernacular geometry overlaying topography, natural topography, because it's never flat or regular. So it's a much more rational approach to the terrain to operate in a vernacular pattern. But on the other hand, the classical, the Euclidean models can be extremely powerful by establishing lines of vision to something which we are not in the natural landscape used to. So a straight line in irregular landscape can be an extremely powerful statement, artistic statement, particularly when it addresses important topographical features, or as in the case of Washington or Williamsburg, or towns which were very consciously planned with monumental buildings, of creating important focuses, which are foci which are not just geometric foci, but which become symbolic foci and which become enormously powerful symbols of the public realm. And you all know how powerful these classical buildings of Washington are, because in every picture you see of Washington, you see somewhere the White House or the dome of the rotunda. Now, I analyzed this relationship. So what is it which makes a comfortable relationship between a classical or vernacular architecture and classical or vernacular urban patterns? And I found generally, and you can analyze that yourself by visiting places, is that when you have a highly irregular pattern, which follows, or what looks irregular but which follows easily the topographic irregularities, you can often have very poor architecture, vernacular, with absolute no rhetoric or great statements, like Japanese villages where you have no architecture. It's just basically vernacular stuff, but settling along topographic lines, and you have places of enormous charm without any classism. You have these vernacular villages in Afghanistan, which you see now a lot in pictures, which are incredibly charming and nestling in the topography, or in Morocco or in Italy, or the hill towns. They are really often. I lived myself for many years in a French village where there was no architecture, and it was a place of extreme charm, just with nice windows and shutters and cornices made out of tiles, and just with a few columns inside the church, but there was nothing, there was no architecture to speak of. Whereas if you imagine the grand avenues of Paris or Washington just lined by vernacular stuff, it would be absolutely dreadful. Imagine these enormous avenues, Champs-Élysées, just lined with vernacular buildings and holes in the wall and no decoration, nothing at all. It would be unacceptable. So there is some relationship between the architecture you use, the function it is there for, which it serves, the meaning it takes, and the geometric pattern of the composition. And once you are conscious of it, you analyze this. I developed this for a charrette. I was in with a group of planners in Chico, California, and I tried to explain how to get this into something which is more than just an accumulation of building. And I had a sleepless night, and I identified 7 categories, and I then present this to the group, and there was a mathematician there, forget his name, but he said, brilliant, absolutely, yes, but there are 9 categories, which is because there are 3 possibilities. You have vernacular, you have classical, and you have a combination of vernacular and classical. Now, the world is generally, good towns are a mixture of all these categories. And you have the same for urbanism, that you have regular, irregular patterns, or what we call irregular patterns, vernacular patterns, you have classical patterns, and generally, where these try to meet, you have problems, like even Haussmann was unable to master completely the mixing of those two, because clearly the classical is often related to power which is trying to intervene in established pattern, and often these powers, they don't live long enough to impose their schemes. And because the vernacular patterns are much closer to life, to the business and uncontrollability of social intercourse. Now, once these categories are known, you can then mix them. You can not only analyze them, you can, within these 9 categories, you can virtually classify every place you visit in the world, whether it's starting from here, going to Williamsburg and to historic towns around the world. You can classify, you can find how architecture and urbanism relate. And then you can classify for yourself what you think is the most powerful combination. I myself find that a mix of everything is generally the most powerful combination. Because I remember visiting the disappointment of visiting these Italian utopian towns of the Renaissance, or even French new towns like Richelieu and so on. And they are dreadfully boring, even though they are beautifully designed, or the Vauban new towns in France. They're impeccably designed, and everything seems to be in the right place, but there's something slightly boring about it. And what is the salt is when you have these areas of conflict and mixing, and this is just the beginning of a discipline, but it's interesting when you visit places, you understand these categories, and you can have a beginning of it's really a typology which still needs to be filled out. But the absolute toxic situation is, do we have the pointer? Maybe. The middle category is when you have the absolute Euclidean geometry, urban geometry, and vernacular architecture rendered symmetrical. It becomes absolutely toxic and impersonal and unbearable, and we call it generally barracks architecture. And you can't even find that then there is a reason, that in all these mixtures of vernacular classicism or these mixtures of both, there is actually a function which goes with them, because there are places which you want to be boring, and others where you need variety, and there are places where it makes sense to have boring architecture, and there are places where you absolutely cannot do without variety and without a mix of public and private. And it is these categories which still need to be established, but at least to be announced. That when you have architecture which is vernacular and urbanism which is vernacular, it forms a very nice and easy bond, and you can never have enough of it. But you cannot have a metropolis done just of vernacular urbanism and vernacular architecture. It becomes unmanageable, even though I'm not totally sure, because for instance, Tokyo is a very interesting example of a very vast city, a vast metropolis, which has almost no intervention of Euclidean architecture or Euclidean large-scale streams. Because in Tokyo, even the very vast avenues which circle it and which cut through it are of vernacular kind, but there the architecture is extremely varied and colorful, and you have inside of these metropolitan blocks, you have an enormous variety of architecture. When you have the architecture is a mixture of vernacular and classicism, and urbanism is vernacular, this forms, I think, the most interesting mixture, which you encounter almost in every historic, what we call historic town in Europe. What Paris was probably before Haussmann, and what Rome is largely still today. And then unfortunately I have to, you know who I mean here, the Aldo Rossi syndrome. I have nothing against Aldo Rossi, but unfortunately he did not understand the vernacular side because he used the architectural vernacular often with vast Euclidean schemes, and they're absolutely deadly. I think they can produce very nice pictures, but you cannot build towns that way. Now, when you have a classical geometry and classical architecture, this fits extremely well for very important central locations, imperial locations, centers of power, and of which there is often an excess, but that's the way these things work. Of course, the Mall in Washington and so on. The great imperial fora in Rome, and so on. Here you have a mixture of vernacular and classical architecture and urbanism, which is classical, which is also extremely interesting. And that is what, let's say, now I have to go back here. This would be the situation of the Republican fora in Rome, the Campo Vaccino, or whatever it was called in the 18th century. And then when architecture is vernacular and you have an urbanism which is mixed, that generally works very well. And this is a mode of analysis, but it's also a mode for a system for once you plan cities to mix and to indicate, to give indications for where public buildings and private buildings should be, and in how far you want to invest. Classical architecture, not only I found it out to my own pain, is when you have a large urban scheme nowadays to develop, you cannot have large amounts of classism because you always get it wrong. You can correct the position of the column 100 times and the industry gets it wrong. They put the columns upside down. With Marianne, I don't know whether she's here, Marianne Cusato, with whom we did this book on Get Your House Right, but it's also Get Your Town Right. And we were sitting in this hotel in Washington, and I was overlooking the pool, and there was a little temple there. And I thought, we're working, so I looked at these columns. There was something strange about the columns. Then I finally understood. I got up and saw there are 12 columns upside down. This was luxury in a hotel with civilized people who should know about these things. Because the little slot which lets the humidity out was at the top instead of the bottom. And nobody had noticed. Now, I noticed that on the new euro banknotes, there are 15 mistakes of an architectural kind. Imagine there were 15 mistakes of an orthographic kind. I mean, it would be a universal scandal. But the architectural mistakes nobody notices. And the 500 banknote, euro banknote, which is the highest valuta, is the most boring, how do you call it, mur rideau, the window, the curtain wall. Can you imagine, for the euro, a curtain wall for the highest value banknote. The others have the Pont du Gard or the classical monuments and so on. Well, that's where we are, but it's still, we have a good time. Now, I think the best formula is probably where you are safest, is to have a mix of everything, but in the right position and for the right functions. But use classicism with economy because it's very difficult to get it right. And there are very few architects who are trained enough to get it right, or if they are trained enough, often the builders are not, and they don't understand, and they think you got it wrong. So this is now the condition to do good tuning is you need an instrument. You cannot do architectural tuning if you don't have an instrument, if you have the materials and the wood and the strings lying on the floor. It's not an instrument, it's just material. And modern towns are just displays of material, but they are not yet tuned. Now, first of all, you have to get the functional mixture right, the building height right. And then where you apply the classicism or the vernacular modes, now the top image is one which is completely without architecture, and it would be, of course, an austerity vernacular. Because true vernacular, the charms of vernacular, become only bearable. And we had a bit of a feeling here when we did this building, in how far this building, even though it's still sort of monumentalized vernacular because we just didn't have the money to do more and we didn't want to because it's not that important after all. But it's extraordinary how these rather poor buildings around the old school buildings, how they were getting a different status by suddenly being in contrast not just with themselves, where they were rather boring, back and front and glass and so on, but rather tediously boring, Baroque type architecture, in how they became much more interesting by having a scale opposing them and setting their right context. And then you have, of course, extreme classicism, sort of empire classicism, let's say Chicago, 1893, where you had the most talented of architects suddenly rediscovering classical architecture and doing this colossal, absolutely incredible effort of the White City for the Chicago World Exhibition. But where you feel this is just a temporary thing, there's so much architecture, there's so much architectural noise and display, that of course you cannot have every town being designed that way. That's good for a big show and a big carnival, but it's too much for everyday life. So I think it's this mixture of vernacular and classicism which really makes the best cities. And this is like cursor where you start with vernacular, 100% vernacular is related more to animal architecture, who don't know classicism, or at least we don't know, but at least it looks all vernacular. And then the extreme of 100% classicism, which is the Beaux-Arts utopia, the Chicago White City, and so on. And then you have the mixture in between. And I think that probably if you have about 20 to 30% of classicism, and then the rest vernacular, and they are in the right position, you can get the best cities in the world, whether it's Williamsburg or Venice, or cities in India and pre-Columbian America and so on. So what is absolutely fundamental to get the city right is mixed use, in close proximity and as neighbors. So that the variety which you design from, the program which you design is already varied, and the architect just gives the right amount of articulation or decor for what is needed to contrast the private and the public, the collective and the individual. But mixed use is a necessary condition, but is not sufficient, because you could well have a single building having all those functions in one single building, and it is not a city. And I think the quoting always forever, the medieval, the Renaissance treatise as being the correct answer, that the house is a small city and the city is a large house, is not true. The city is something different from a house, completely different. It's of a different nature, typological and character-wise and so on, and socially, definitely. So it's absolutely necessary, but is not sufficient. And then the mixed use does not necessarily, and even if it is necessary and sufficient, not sufficient condition, you can get the mix right, but may not produce architecture at all. Because if you have this idea of a totally uniform skyline, or which was Haussmannian, often what's misunderstood as Haussmannian, where the buildings are more or less the same building height, and just the articulation of the facade is different, which you often have in Richelieu or these places of utopian design, that it produces also a form of boredom. And because not only do you need the right location and the contrast of architecture, but also the volumetric difference which calls for classicism or allows vernacular to happen. And you can also get it completely wrong, like you have in Manhattan, where the private dominates and where the library and the temple and are all dominated by condominia and so on. So there are many ways you can get it wrong. And we got it all wrong, and most of our cities, modern cities, have it terribly wrong, and it's so wrong that you don't notice anymore, because you are so used now to the chaotic sound that your ears are totally distorted and you can't hear the melody anymore. So this would be the correct applying. That's the public building, that's a private building, and it's a contrast of both which creates really the powerful artistic statement. And here you would have the private realm excessively decorated, the public realm under-decorated. Here you have the volume, the right application, but the volumes are wrong. So there, as I said, there are many ways of getting it wrong, and we sure need a good rethinking. Now, typologically, for instance, you have, in traditional cultures, you have an extraordinary difference between public buildings and private buildings. And public buildings are not really enlargements of private buildings. They are of a different nature, because the theater and a house are totally different things, and the palace is also a different thing from a house. And that is why a school and the church and all those traditional types have been developed, not out of unconsciousness, but because intuitively there was no theory about it, but the use of natural materials and of a social order which tended towards, against chaos, to establish strong traditional forms. Also, there was an architecture of stability which wanted to maintain those forms and which created language. Now, this is where it contrasts with modernism, where you have really no typological culture. where the house or the concert hall may exactly be made of the same material, they are just of a different size. And I remember it so clearly when I first saw the festival hall in London. It looks like the Villa Savoye of Corbusier, just enlarged 5-6 times, but virtually the same thing. And you have it also in the reaction to that modernism, which is now this forms of expressionism, where the house is like this and the concert hall is like that, and everything is like this and that. And there's no more contrast, there's no scale, it's just big or small, but there's no real distinction between public and private language, between architecture and building. Now, that is something I think we reached the end of it, and but we are now in a situation where not only do we have synthetic materials, but we have synthetic language. We are really in a situation of kitsch culture, because modernism still has a pretense to be authentic, accusing people who do traditional buildings of being inauthentic. But the question is that everyone knows when the traditional building looks fake, whereas modernism is fake by nature, because there is no true form of modernism. The material, concrete, steel, and glass, these materials, they allow you to do any inauthentic form, but it stands up because that's just the way the material allows. You can put a building upside down, a concrete building upside down, still you can roll it on the side. It doesn't make any difference. A Frangieri you can lay on its back, and you don't know what is the correct form of the building. Now it may make very nice shapes, but it does not really, it's not an architectural language. So how to get out of a situation of inauthenticity and make authentic traditional buildings is almost impossible. I have been trying, and because industry is now so geared to synthetic materials that the exercise of using glues and concretes does not tell those who execute the buildings, does not speak to them by results of action. That you can almost build any form nowadays you can cast in concrete and it will still stand up, whereas with natural materials you cannot build an arch the wrong way without it collapsing. So I think we're in a situation where not only do we have artificially and through a very strong theory to control urban development and urban composition, but also in how far, when you do even the smallest traditional building, in how far you manage to control an industry of the inauthentic in order to produce at least an image which looks authentic. Because even the vernacular nowadays has become a style. And a style which needs extreme control, because otherwise it looks extremely wrong. And making huge efforts, requiring huge efforts from architects, because they need to control not only the form, but also the process which so naturally leads to error. And I think I'm going to end there because I think we had a good time so far. And but it's really this notion that all this, how can you coordinate, create a larger image which is harmonious, whereas nature, even in its most chaotic situations, produces beauty if you are at the right distance. And unfortunately, we now, even with all our efforts, all our committees and all our aesthetic control and charters of Venice and Athens and all the charters of the world, we seem to be incapable of doing naturally something which used to be so, so convincing in the past. And if we don't choose to do it, I think we'll be forced to do it fairly soon when the fossil fuel become very expensive. Thank you very much on that optimistic note.